Well, I want to welcome everybody to the Community History Dialogue. My name is Cindy Bendroth, and I'm a division chief here at the Pennsylvania State Archives. We started having these dialogues back in September of 2020 during COVID in order to have some of the communities come together and hear how others have told their story and their history of their community through either technology or oral histories or traditional collecting or even art. So today we're focusing in on the religious communities. If you have any technical difficulties, we can try to assist. Please call Josh Stallman, and his email will be in the chat function. We're hoping most of you know how to use Zoom by now. Please be aware that today's speakers portion will be recorded, but after the dialogue that we have with the rest of the audience will not be recorded. So to ensure that the presenter, audio is uninterrupted, all the participants have been muted. And once they're done, when we're done with the presentation, you will be unmuted and allowed to speak if you have any conversation, or you can also put things in chat. And lastly, we want anything of interest that you have, any feedback that you have, what you did like, what you don't like, what other communities or that you'd be interested in hearing about. If you could let us know any dialogues later on, so you can get in touch with either Tyler Stump, Josh Stallman, or myself. And as we were talking before we started the program, is that there are a lot of religious archives around the country, and there are many dioceses, like the Catholic or Episcopal Church, they have their archives. There's a congregational archives up in New England and also in Lancaster. There's the Latter-day Saints. There's Presbyterian in Philadelphia, and there's Jewish museums and archives around the country. But many of the congregations are part of the, even if they're part of a larger religious experience, they have their own unique history to tell about their local community. So today we have 3 individuals that are working on their congregation's history. I'd like to introduce them now. And I was told that they went in order of age of their congregation, not themselves, but of the congregation. So first off, we have Carol Smith, who's an independent curator and archivist who's worked with the Christ Church Archives since 2005, when she was hired to create a digital archives website. And over the last few years, she's served as a primary investigator on a Council on the Library and Information Resources CLEAR funded Hidden Collections digitization project to be placed online the records of 11 of Philadelphia's oldest congregations. She has a BA in American Civilization and an MA in Material Culture from the University of Pennsylvania and is a certified archivist. Margaret Jerrido has been an archivist for Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia since 2008. She has consulted with other African American churches who need guidance on collecting, arranging, and preserving historical documents, photographs, and memorabilia. And I just want to add that I know her because she was head of special collections for Temple University for many years. And Barry Rudel is a member of the Beth Sholom congregation in Johnstown. And his talk will focus on the importance of local partnerships in the area of historic preservation and interpretation. We'd like to welcome you all.
Thank you so much. And I guess I am going to try to share my screen here. I am absolutely delighted to be here to talk about the Christ Church Archives. Christ Church, established in 1695, was the first Anglican church in Pennsylvania, a colony established by William Penn as a place of refuge for his fellow Quakers, and a place where all might find the freedom to worship as they chose. Philadelphia was a very small town in 1695, the year Christ Church acquired the land to build its first small church. Roughly 1,500 people lived here. By the mid-18th century, Oh dear. I'm going to have to stop sharing briefly and try to get this working again. My apologies. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Hopefully it'll be smoother from here on in. By the mid-18th century, the city had grown, has had the number of congregations and the size of the churches, as you can see in this view of the east prospect of the city of Philadelphia. Christ Church, which is number 1 on this engraving, shows the new bigger church with a finished steeple. First Presbyterian is number 4, and the Dutch Church is number 5. Gloria Dei was south of this image. Other congregations, Mikveh Israel, First Baptist, St. George's United Methodist Church, the First Moravian Church, either would soon follow or already existed but are not as visible. The Reverend Joseph Grayton said Mass in his residence for the congregation of Old St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. By the latter part of the century, the city's first African American churches would form, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas and Mother Bethel AME. Christ Church remained a leading congregation in Philadelphia in the 18th century. It was here that some of the Penns, the Commonwealth's early governors, worshipped, as well as later members of the Continental Congress, presidents of the United States, and members of the federal government, when it was headquartered here in Philadelphia. 7 signers of the Declaration of Independence are buried either at Christ Church or its burial ground at 5th and Arch Streets. But Christ Church also counted among its congregants cabinet makers and carpenters, surgeons and physicians, sea captains and widows, printers, metal workers and silversmiths, enslaved and free African Americans. And one of our early founders was apparently a pirate. We know this from our records, supplemented by others, which thankfully for the most part have survived. What saved the Christ Church records? It was early interest by rectors. The Reverend Benjamin Dorr used the vestry minutes and sacramental registers to write his history of Christ Church in 1842. The Christ Church Historical Association formed at the end of the 19th century, and while it wasn't terribly long-lived, it added to this body of knowledge. And we had interest by outside groups who had shared a connection with the church and wanted to come back to celebrate that shared history in services. And of course, it's the effort of lots and lots of dedicated volunteers. It is likely that early records were stored off-site in the homes of the clerks or the rector's wardens, which may account for the fact that even though the church was established in 1695, based on the deed for the property, our sacramental registers don't start until 1708, and our vestry minutes in 1717. From that time forward, however, we have a fairly complete run of records. Minutes, registers, accounting records, correspondence, and more. In later years, they were stored in the church itself. According to church lore, the library, archives, and office were stored in the room above the tower room. Before the 1930s installation of the Curtis organ, as well as other nooks and crannies in the church. And obviously, even in earlier years, there was great interest in searching these records, as you can see by this note, which appears on all of our early registers. Persons searching the records must pay 25 cents to the sexton for every search. A major change took place in 1980 when Bruce Gill, then the business manager for the church, entered into a partnership with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to apply for an NHPRC grant to process the church's archives and microfilm them. During that process, which took place at HSP, an underground basement vault area was created for the storage of the archives. You entered through this secure vault door, one of those awful locks that we all hate, and then carefully stepped down the spiral staircase. Fast forward another 30-some years, and the church was out of archival space, as you can see here. Neighborhood house renovations in 2009 doubled that space, and this is a view of part of the renovated archives. At the same time, we began to create a digital presence. We began by putting our collections, both archival and artifact, online through Past Perfect. Keyword searches allow you to see all the artifact or archival holdings we have related to a topic, in this case, Bishop William White, the first bishop of Pennsylvania. We also began to enter our baptismal, marriage, and burial records into an Access database, working from those old WPA registers, a project created by the government during the throes of the Great Depression. Later funding for the Pew Charitable Trusts allowed us to expand this work. We scanned and placed online the first 3 volumes of our vestry minutes and continued the compilation of the baptismal, marriage, and burial records through 1900. We also began to add in pew rent records, the lists of those who rented pews each year, a more likely way of telling who attended the church on a consistent basis and who lived in the area. Researchers can click on any one of these links to take them to a field to search. But I still wanted to get those original records online. Many researchers, even with the information found in the database, still wanted to see the original baptismal certificates, etc. And hereditary organizations often required copies of them for membership. This is where the idea of applying for a Clear Hidden Collections digitization grant to scan and place online in one unified website the records of many of Philadelphia's early congregations came into being. We knew our records told a compelling story. Collectively, the records of these assorted congregations are even more impressive. After one unsuccessful attempt, we were funded in the fall of 2017. And now, 3 years later, you can see not only the records of Christ Church, but those of other early denominations as well. And PhiladelphiaCongregations.org is this website. This is an Omeka website, and in addition to those early records, we have now incorporated through harvesting additional records, those of the Society of Friends and Old St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. A recent PHMC grant is going to allow us to bring in the records of the First Moravian Church, as well as some additional records from each of the original congregations. So which of the Christ Church records are online? These are the same types of records you will want to preserve for your congregations. There are vestry minutes, reflecting the decisions made for the governance of the congregation. Here you see the Vestry Resolution of July 4th, 1776. Whereas the Honorable Continental Congress have resolved to declare the American colonies to be free and independent states, in consequence of which it will be proper to omit those petitions in the liturgy wherein the King of Great Britain is prayed for, as inconsistent with the said declaration. Therefore resolved that it appears to this vestry to be necessary for the peace and well-being of the churches to omit the said petitions, and the rector and assistant ministers of the United Churches are requested in the name of the vestry and their constituents to omit such petitions as are above mentioned. Even with congregations not as old as Christ Church, vestry minutes recall the past, not as vividly as we might hope, since their main purpose is to record the business decisions of the church. But you'll find references to special services scheduled for parishioners during wartime, visits by dignitaries, struggles to maintain properties, etc. There are, of course, the sacramental registers, the baptisms, marriages, and burials. These too reflect the social times, the yellow fever and smallpox epidemics of the 1790s. In more recent years, the influenza deaths from 1918. There are accounting records. Here we have the steeple accounts from the 1750s, where we record payments to the architect, Robert Smith, to other individuals, and for supplies, including one to Evan Morgan, all the way down at the bottom here, for rum. Must have given them courage to ascend that steeple. And here we have the Sexton's burial records. The Sexton is the one who actually dug the graves, and his records are more detailed than our burial service records. He will often record the cause of death, the age of the individual, and so on. This particular page records the deaths of the 7 Native American chiefs who came to visit President Washington on a state visit in 1793 and sadly died of smallpox before they could return to their tribes. And even our sermons reflect the nature and feelings of the times. Here are some lines from the sermon of the Reverend Benjamin Dorr on the death of Abraham Lincoln. Standing now, as it were, by the new-made grave of our lamented Lincoln, whose name hereafter is to be associated in our minds and hearts with that of Washington, and looking back upon the last 4 years of deadly strife, and down upon the monster, rebellion, crushed beneath the feet of a victorious people, never again to raise its hydra heads, may we not, must we not, in the fullness of our hearts, praise not only with our lips, but in our lives, by a humble and holy obedience to all his righteous laws. These are the types of records we have online. More recent records were microfilmed but have not been scanned. I had cut off the records that were going online at 1871, so we didn't have to worry about privacy or copyright issues. But you certainly want to save those more recent records. You would want a complete run of vestry and/or trustee and congregational minutes. You want a full set of general ledgers and, of course, the sacramental registers. You also want to save the newsletters, service leaflets if you have them, even if they're in electronic format today, staff lists, accounting records. Begin to collect oral histories from your longtime members, staff, and clergy. And don't forget electronic records. These can run the gamut from general ledgers and membership lists, kept in different types of software programs, which you can download and save as PDFs, to YouTube recordings. So many churches went to YouTube for their virtual worship services this year. There are guides to help in this process, and this is one of my favorites. The South Carolina Historic Records Commission Guide to Religious Records. And don't hesitate to reach out to the historical arms of your denomination, Presbyterian Historical Society, the American Baptist Historical Society, the Archives of the Episcopal Church, as well as many other denominations have resources to help. And many other sites exist as well. Here is a site that I thought was particularly useful for Catholic records, but the checklist that they offer is useful for any congregation that wants to get started. Don't be daunted by this task. Recruit volunteers, organize your committee, seek outside help, set up one centralized location to store your records, and start to dig in. Begin with an inventory, assess condition, start to organize by category, being careful to retain original order if you can. Keep good notes as you go along, and above all, enjoy the process. No one will love your records as much as you and the other members of your congregation will. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Jerrido, and let me get my screen up here to share with you. I'm the archivist at Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And to follow Carol, indeed, we began in 1791. This is a mural that leads down to our museum, which sort of captures the history in one mural. Here's Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Up here is the blacksmith shop, which Richard Allen had hauled to the corner of 6th and Lombard in Philadelphia in 1794. However, he purchased the land in 1791. As the congregation grew, so did the buildings. Still on the same property. This is the second building, built in 1805. The third building, built in 1840, and the current building, which was built in 1890. The current building has the original pews, stained glass windows, which people like to come and see, and each window tells a history in itself. This is our archives. Little crowded, but it shows that we at least trying to do some preservation, basic preservation using archival folders and boxes. Some of our early records are on microfilm. We do have a microfilm reader. We do not have a printer. However, our microfilm is duplicated in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is not very far from us. And they do have a reader and a printer, so that if you get an opportunity to go there, you can ask for the Mother Bethel microfilm, and they can show you the same thing that we have. Because our space is so limited and so tight, I'm only able to entertain 1, 2 at the most researchers. Of course, right now, our church is closed to the public until further notice. So, our website is currently being redeveloped and upgraded to include additional ministries within the church, and just to upgrade it in general. The homepage, which is currently being revamped, will include 3 large buttons, one being the church, the second being the museum. I will say that we do have a really great museum with artifacts that go back to Richard Allen's time period. We have his original pew there and some benches that were used in the blacksmith shop. So I certainly encourage people to come and take a look at our museum. However, I don't oversee the museum. We do need to get a curator, but I try to make sure that things are sort of clean and in order there until we do get someone else. And then the third button will be the archives. The archives button will have a drop-down menu, which will include a PDF of my inventory of the collections in the archives. So I just wanted to share with you some of the things that will be on that drop-down menu. We'll discuss and show you what our manuscript collection includes. You will see that it says 1760 to 1890, with a little bit of a break there from 1910 to 1933, and then a big break between 33 and 1960. We have a committee called the Historical Society, and that was established in 1912. Fortunately, the president of the Historical Society at that time began to collect materials. So we really, between 1760 and 1912, very little was done to collect material. So we're really grateful to him for having had the thought to at least begin to collect materials, even though they were just thrown into a room. Then in, I guess about the 1960s, there was a librarian who picked up the ball and continued to collect materials and put them into some sort of order. I came in 2008, excuse me, and continued on. I tried to group material into the following categories so to make it easy to search. And these are some of the large categories that we have. One of our most important categories is the funeral programs. which I'm sure many of you are aware that the obituaries contain a lot of history. And then we have a category of individuals, which includes our bishops, our pastors, and our members. Now, I have to say, the material in Mother Bethel only includes material about the church and its members, not the denomination. What we do is we refer those other churches, A.M.E. churches, to our historiographer, who is located in Tennessee, and she collects all the material and information about the A.M.E. denomination as a whole. Again, I have to just tell people they think that we have, information about a church in Chester, and we really don't. However, the one exception is Mother Bethel has information about all of the bishops. Not all of the bishops were pastors of Mother Bethel. However, some of the pastors became bishops. Pastors of Mother Bethel became bishops, but that is the one exception to the rule, that we do have information about all of the A.M.E. bishops. The members, of course, are only members of Mother Bethel. Then another large category are our photographs. And our photographs are then further broken down into the following subcategories. And then the individuals are further broken down into these subcategories. Some of the individuals were prominent people who actually visited Mother Bethel, such as Rosa Parks. There she is right there. She's talking to our Young People's Division, the YPD. And then here is Bishop Coppin's wife, Fanny Jackson Coppin, who was an educator in Philadelphia. But we do have information as well as in photographs of these people. Then other categories are books about the A.M.E. denomination. They're just a book collection. And then the one main publication that we have is our Christian Recorder. This was a publication begun for the A.M.E. Church. And it started in 1854, ran until 1856. Again, there was a little bit of a break, and it began again in 1861, and it has continued from 1861 to the present. So this is a really useful tool, particularly for genealogists who want to know about some of their family members. And I say that because in the Christian Recorder, there is a section called Information Wanted. The Information Wanted section not only talked about housing that's available, clothing for cost, but it had a section for those people who were looking for their relatives. So it would say something like, Margaret Jerrido is looking for her mother who was on the slave plantation of so-and-so in the state of such and such during the time period 1863 to 64 or something like that. So this paper includes so much information, and for those who are African Americans who are looking for their descendants. In addition, I've been working with Judith Giesberg at Villanova University, who has created a website called informationwanted.org. And she had used the Christian Recorder as the basis for her website. She collected all the information wanted ads and included into her website. She's gone around the country and searched out other African American papers, gotten information wanted ads from their papers. And currently the website includes almost, if not close to 4,000 ads. So we're sort of proud of the fact that she used our Christian Reporter as the basis for her project. So the African American Episcopal Church denomination started on the corner of 6th and Lombard Streets, and it has continued there since 1791 to the present, and is the continuously owned piece of land operated by African Americans. We now service over 40 countries on 5 continents. So we're a pretty large denomination. Many of our materials can be found in other repositories, such as the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which I mentioned earlier, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, the Atwater Kent Museum, Library Company of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Tribune, Temple University's Blockson Collection, University of Penn, just to name a few. It's just that we have found memorabilia, manuscripts, publications in these various other repositories, which I included this to say that for those of you who may be doing funding, who maybe want to do a collaborative kind of thing with other possible resources within your close denomination, that you could probably get some funding to do something. So just to go over arrangement of materials for churches. These are just broad categories that Carol did mention some when she was doing her presentation. So we have manuscripts, books, printed materials, photographs, artifacts. And when I say artifacts, I'm not talking about the large items. We're talking about things like medals and stamps and shoes, maybe those kinds of things that may be in your archives. And then of course, there's always the audio visual. So just some basic preservation ideas is to remove all fasteners, staples, rubber bands, paper clips from your letters, manuscripts, scrapbooks, programs, and newspapers. Photographs, we ask that you place them in archival quality sleeves. Memorabilia can be stored in archival boxes. AV, same thing. These are some places where I suggest that you can go for supplies and providers, and I just give you some recommendations for what to get from each place. I'm not going to go over this. What I will say, though, that you can get a copy of the Guide to Collections Care, paper, photographs, textiles, and books from Gaylord. Just call them and they'll send you a copy for free, which I always like free. And then, of course, I always go to Hollinger for some things. And popular items that I generally purchase from Hollinger are these types of things that I was talking about earlier. I mentioned sleeves, polypropylene sleeves, slide storage, file folders, and of course the gray boxes that you initially saw in my overcrowded archives are these document storage cases. Other places that you can go to, these are just recommendations. The Page Company, the popular item to buy from the Page Company is the Miracle Box number 15, which is kind of like a banker's box. That's the size of it. And it comes with a separate lid. Very useful to have. And this is the guide to collections that I mentioned that you can get from Gaylord. And then just some suggested funding sources. I believe Carol got some money from CLEAR, Council on Library and Information Resources. I think that's correct. And then of course there's NHPRC, the IMLS, NEH, PHMC, PHC, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Just some, again, you may want to collaborate with some of your neighbors, and you might be able to get some funding. So I thank you and good luck with your project.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Carol. And it's a privilege for Johnstown's Beth Sholom congregation to be a part of the Pennsylvania State Archives Community History Program. Beth Sholom has long held an interest in preserving its records and archives and interpreting the history of Jewish Johnstown. Thank you for including us. The efforts were always volunteer run and have at times been supplemented with grants that provided valuable professional expertise, archival management, and interpretive scholarship. Like many ethnic communities, Johnstown's Jewish community was reflective of the general community. In Johnstown, home to the 1889 flood and a cradle of industrial America, preserving history was at our core. Johnstown Area Heritage Association, JAHA, provided a partnership, guidance, and staffing at different times over the last 40 years. Beth Sholom leadership has been the impetus and driving force, with Dr. Meyer and Sally Bloom establishing space and vision for the early collection, and then guided by their daughter, Judith Bloom Lantos. A set of 1980s oral interviews coincided with the University of Pennsylvania sociologist work in ethnic studies, resulting in Iwa Moroska's award-winning monograph entitled Insecure Prosperity. Funded by the David A. Glosser Foundation, the Bierman Fund, and the United Jewish Federation of Johnstown, this book used some of Beth Zion Rabbi Leonard Winograd's doctoral thesis entitled The Horse Died in Wimber on the Glosser family's coming to Johnstown to formalize and tell the Flood City's Jewish history. And what a rich history it is. The Jewish community dates back to 1854, when the Pennsylvania Railroad was linked by the Horseshoe Curve to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Cambria Iron Company was born. Johnstown was a former canal town, and that Cambria Iron Company mushroomed its population. 100 years later, local newspaper assistant editor Saul Spiegel captured an early history for the 1954 Rodef Sholom Synagogue Golden Anniversary book. That piece, along with Winograd's work and the usual boxes of records that any congregation would normally accumulate, served as the grist, if you will, for Moroska and others to study and move forward. And I'm just going to show a picture of, this was Saul Spiegel's work in 1954. Rabbi Leonard Winograd then did a lot of basic primary research with the newspapers and up at Evansburg at the courthouse to produce this monograph and his doctoral thesis, The Horse Died in Wimber. And then Iwa Moroska took all of that, along with oral interviews, to produce her award-winning monograph. Ruth Glosser's fine history of her large and prominent family and her husband, Isidore's Federation and synagogue leadership, along with the interest of Elmer Match and Ben Isaacson, spurred on Iwa Moroska's project, with her writings and guidance reflected in Jaha's permanent exhibit at the Discovery Center. This fine museum extended out the collection space of the Johnstown Flood Museum. which was an old Carnegie library rebuilt after the 1889 flood, but by 1989, it was bursting at the seams. So it was natural for the Jewish community to hang on to its early photos and records, as we were inclined to do so, and Jaha encouraged it, and Beth Zion, the Reformed congregation in Johnstown, had documented itself quite well. Another equal and extremely valued partner was and is the Rao Jewish History Program and Archives of the Senator John Hines History Center in Pittsburgh. The natural resources underneath the Keystone State, particularly in Western PA, threw off sizable small towns, and they had to be sizable, or Jews, primarily merchants, wouldn't have come to those towns. Jewish Americans are mostly an urban people, even if that area happened to be Johnstown. Cambria County was highly urban, with Jewish communities throughout the county. The 1,800 Johnstown Jews, a 1960s figure, only made up less than 2% of the total population, but maybe about 40% of the downtown businesses. The Rao Jewish Archives also provided expertise, as Johnstown's passionate volunteers knew enough to connect with them in the 1990s to provide a carload of records and an appropriate grant to catalog Jewish Johnstown. The three congregations had merged into one, and the community was losing population, down to a few hundred. More interpretation was presented as part of the 1989 Johnstown Flood Centennial, as of course, every ethnic group likes to wave its flag as a minority within a majority culture. And 24 Jews died in the Johnstown flood, 10% of the 240 Jews that lived in Johnstown at that time. And Johnstown's Jewish community was a very early one. As early as 1874, the Jewish-owned stores in Johnstown all had agreed to close for the Jewish High Holy Days. Not that these German Jews were that observant, but they wanted to do it as a collective. The Hines collection is well organized into 15 archive boxes, and Jaha also has an outstanding collection of 3D objects, records, and ephemera. Eric Lidgy at the Rao and Richard Burkert at Jaha are both outstanding professionals and real friends to Jewish Johnstown. As Johnstown's population continued to decline during the 1970s with the steel decline, so did its Jewish community size. With more Johnstown Jews living in Pittsburgh than in Johnstown, there became a desire to further ensure the history of the community. The 125th anniversary of Johnstown's Jewish community in 2013, commemorating the 1888 Hebrew Burial Association Cemetery in the new Grandview Cemetery, was the impetus for this year-long exhibit held at the Discovery Center. And Grandview Cemetery, in and of itself, is worth a visit. With the 816 unknown victims from the 1889 flood, buried Arlington style, it may be the second most hallowed ground in all of Pennsylvania, next to Gettysburg. And that unknown plot that was dedicated in 1892 with 10,000 citizens, including the governor of Pennsylvania, happened to be placed coincidentally next to the oldest Jewish burial ground between Altoona and Pittsburgh. The Hebrew Burial Association dates back to 1888, pre-flood. And Grandview Cemetery is a valued partner of Johnstown's Jewish community. The 125th anniversary, funded by the Abe and Janet Bierman Fund, one of the most significant funds in Johnstown in general, and a substantial one for Jewish charities nationwide and worldwide, funded the interpretive panels and Jaha's exhibit that Beth Sholom worked with the Community Foundation for the Alleghenies with. And that's another valued partner, the Community Foundation for the Alleghenies. Those interpretive panels, after 1 year, now serve as the core exhibit at Beth Sholom. Regarding preservation, the elders in the 1980s left back some cream, and 4 file boxes of photos and records are organized and housed in Johnstown's Jewish Museum at Beth Sholom. The museum is dedicated to what was the most densely populated Jewish community between Philadelphia's Northeast and Pittsburgh's Squirrel Hill. No doubt the manifestation of Cambria Iron Company, later bought out by Bethlehem Steel. Post-1889 flood and then post-World War II were boom times in Cambria County and in Johnstown, and that was reflected in its Jewish community. Harrisburg, of course, was much larger, may have had 4,500 Jews, but it was more spread out from the river and Green Street and 2nd Avenue, the whole way up Lingelstown Road into Susquehanna Township. Johnstown's Jewish community, although there were other areas in Cambria County with Jews, was primarily in the Westmont and Southmont area. So you have 1,800 Jews stretched across about 7,000 or 8,000 people. So it was really a manifestation of Bethlehem Steel. Beth Sholom, with the sustained commitment of the dedicated executive committee and board now, have turned its empty classrooms, as we have no Jewish youth, into interpretive space as well. One serves as a Holocaust remembrance room with its Glenn Hoffman World War II collection and exhibits and writings of local Bierman trip students. No less than 20,000 area youth have been to Washington, D.C. to tour the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Mall for a day of learning at the expense of the Abe and Janet Bierman Fund. Our walls at Beth Sholom include a tribute to area rabbis. One was close with Martin Luther King and spent time with him only 2 weeks before King was assassinated. Another rabbi was brought out to Seven Springs to help console the families of the 4 Jewish heroes amongst Flight 93 heroes at Shanksville. Beth Sholom also holds a room dedicated to Israel's heritage, long an important charitable community to social service needs. This room highlights the connection through photos, letters, records, and Judaica. Johnstown is a calling card in New York and in Israel, even to this day. Beth Sholom's key to preservation and interpretation is partnerships. Smaller communities need the expertise provided. Even Johnstown, which is the biggest of small cities in so many ways. A freshened oral history of 10 key residents is online at Jaha's website, assisted ably by the work of the Cambria County Library and Larissa Duncan, another valued partner of Beth Sholom, keeping our legacy alive. 2 Torahs have been donated to Jewish student Hillel organizations at Gettysburg and Central Florida, as the community continues to help emerging congregations, even as it diminishes in size, but not in spirit and value. The preservation of the history can only be done through partnerships with the general community and, in the case of the Jewish community, with Pittsburgh, our bigger sibling. Few communities have changed as dramatically as Johnstown, both the general and the Jewish communities. We, like every community, want to be remembered, and we will be, through the symbiotic relationship with the general community as Jewish Johnstown has been very good to General Johnstown, and we will be remembered within the Jewish community. Newcastle, Uniontown, Latrobe, Monessen, and Oil City have all closed their synagogues within the last few years. All fine communities, very good communities. Johnstown remains only as its base was always larger. Yet there will be a time when the Jewish community as we know it will physically vanish into the thin air of the Allegheny Mountains. I'd like to now ask Tyler to put up a few slides, please. This is the website of Beth Sholom. We have space dedicated to our history. It's an Alexander Sharov 1950s building. He was a Pittsburgh architect, and he also designed the conservative synagogue that was 2 blocks away. And he's most noted for being involved with B'nai Israel in East Liberty in Pittsburgh. Let's move on to the photos tab if we could. It'll just give you a flavor. Jewish Johnstown stays connected by taking trips. And here we went to New York, and right in the front there is a woman dressed in light blue. We just lost her to the community. She was an outstanding poet, Arlen Edelstein, and a real figure in Johnstown and in Western PA. If you'll just scroll down, please, Tyler. Right there in the middle is we work very closely with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have brought traveling exhibits to Johnstown. That was a traveling exhibit that came from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It was on its way from Cape Town, South Africa to Chicago with a one-stop in Johnstown. Please continue down. Abe and Janet Bierman, it's not enough for them to send 800 kids to DC for a day of learning. Now they're involved with sending Bishop McCourt students to Europe for further exploration of man's inhumanity to man. Please continue down. There's some shots of the Raymond Katz windows. Raymond Katz designed about 200 synagogue windows around the country, and Beth Zion was fortunate enough to engage him, and that's a room dedicated now to the Holocaust. That's a table right there in front of you with over 300 index cards from the Jewish soldiers that the local community stayed connected to during World War II. Please continue down. As you can see, these were classrooms that we've kept the bookshelves and use them for displays. Please continue. We also have a room dedicated to Johnstown's connection with Israel, which is a deep one. If you'll continue down, we're again using the old classrooms. That's our main museum right there. Those trophies up top represented, thank you, those trophies up top represented a youth movement. We used to socialize with the youth from Altoona and State College and Du Bois in Indiana in the Allegheny Mountain Council. There's our file boxes. A lot of our stuff is down at the Heinz History Center. Well, we kept back some cream, and if Tyler will scroll down, you'll just see we've stored our boxes in that way. We have some Judaic programs, some Hadassah programs in the 1930s, speakers that have come to Johnstown to speak in behalf of Israel include Governor David Lawrence, Scoop Jackson, Arlen Specter, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. We also had programs in the 1930s and 40s where Eleanor Roosevelt, Clarence Darrow, Leslie Groves were all part of the Beth Zion Forum. And finally, if you'll scroll down, there's a tribute to some of the activities that we've used our bulletin boards for. And if you'll continue down, there's a series of tributes to the rabbis who've been in Johnstown over the years. If you'll continue down, there's the Bloom Archives. It's a nice set of cases in our sisterhood room. Go ahead down. There, right there in the middle is the oldest item of Jewish Johnstown. It's the 1888 record book of the original Hebrew Burial Association. And if you'll continue down one more shot, please. That's a close-up, and if you'll continue down, please. There's one more, there's a shot of 1889, the 1889 flood and debris. And why do we have it? It's in front of A. Cohen and Sons store, one of the 17 Jewish-owned stores back then at that time. If you'll continue down, please. That's a shot of some of the ephemera from the Jewish-owned businesses, as well as a shot of the Glosser family reunion in the top right. Very large, prominent family in Johnstown. If you'll scroll down, that gives you an overview of the Bloom Archives there. During the Deadly Medicine traveling exhibit, there was a woman who wanted to donate her husband's items from World War II, including photos from a one-day work detail when at the liberation of one of the camps. So if you'll just scroll down slowly to see some of the Glenn Hoffman collection. Tyler asked me to impart a few tips on how we developed our collection and what we have done to interpret our story. As a volunteer, I'm humbled by the professional talent that makes up our field and equally impressed with the passion of the many volunteers that at times can drive the smaller museums, especially out here in Western PA. Seek your leadership's input early on any short or long-term project. Couple vision with implementation, as one without the other either spins wheels or produces less than a quality product. And for us involved in faith-based spaces, the value of the church or synagogue assistant and the maintenance staff is important in creating and sustaining the proper physical space and the electronic assistance to both preserve and interpret the important content that we all possess. Special thank you to Beth Sholom's Jim and Tammy Fiffick for their partnership in our work, and to our Rabbi Brandwine, who has a real appreciation for the Jewish community's position within the overall community. And finally, and with travel and visiting starting to open up, come to Johnstown. The industrial history is only outdone by the ethnic history, which is outdone by the 1889 flood story. 2,200 lives were lost. And in between, please consider visiting Beth Sholom to learn more about this unique and storied Jewish community. Thank you, Tyler, and thank you to the Pennsylvania State Archives.